The machinery regulation is set to replace the existing machinery directive. And in many ways, it is similar to the existing directive. In some ways, it goes beyond the directive, and it also clarifies certain aspects when it comes to, say, technical documentation and so on. But let's begin with the basics. Let's look at Article 2, the scope. And the regulation, unsurprisingly, applies to machinery, and it also covers the items mentioned under A, B, C, D, and E, say safety components or lifting accessories or interchangeable equipment. Essentially, parts or systems that are intended to function in tandem with the machinery, which of course, when you add additional equipment, that can also impact the safety of the entire installation. So there's no surprise there. So this is the scope. Under Article 3, you will find a more extensive definition of what a machine actually is. And they also provide definitions for the other items I just mentioned. Just to be clear, this is not the entirety of Article 3. This is just what I could fit on this slide. A couple of examples, though. An addition is that they do explicitly mention e-mobility devices, e-bikes, electric scooters. But essentially all electric machinery is covered. Anything that is not, let's say, operated manually. So that would be thread mills, chainsaws, vehicle servicing lifts, and so on. This is not a definitive product list. These are just examples, just to be clear. Let's look at some general requirements. Broadly, it can be said that the framework is quite similar to what you would expect if you have been working with the directive in the past. Number one, the basis for compliance is that the product, well, the machine and device is compliant with the harmonized standards that apply. We'll get to that in a bit. You need a declaration of conformity. You need technical documentation. CE marking is required. Additional labeling requirements apply. And you also need user instructions. But before that, you need to work out a module that apply. Depending on the type of machinery, you need to follow a certain path or a different certain module. Basically, a module is a path to compliance. And this is also detailed in Eurolex under the machinery regulation. The first thing I need to do is to work out if my device belongs to module A, B and C, G, or H. Once I've done that, I can determine, do I need a notified body? Do they need to certify my device? And if so, what kind of documentation do I need from the notified body? This is the first step because it impacts the entire procedure. In short, you go with module A, it's more of a self-certification procedure. Still, doesn't mean you're exempt from testing. Safety testing, verifying compliance is still required and needs to be properly documented, but not necessarily through a notified body. But this is really the first step. Before you do anything else, work out which module your device is covered by. When that's clear, we can move on and take a look at harmonized standards. As is the case with essentially all CE marking directives and CE marking regulations, harmonized standards serve as blueprints to achieve compliance, to achieve the requirements within the overall directive or regulation, but for a specific product. So in short, whereas the machinery regulation sets requirements for all machinery, and while it mentions e-bikes, it does not give me a definitive list of technical requirements, design requirements, performance requirements that my e-bike must comply with. So if I'm selling e-bikes within the context of the machinery regulation, I need to go into this list and find the standard, or the standards could be more than one, that apply to, in my case, e-bikes. Okay? And I've conveniently found it right here. 1519 for 2017. Okay? Now keep in mind, it can be more than one harmonized standard that applies to one product. And if I will be selling, say, laser cutting machinery or lifting machinery, I wouldn't be looking at this standard for e-bikes, obviously. So in short, they serve as blueprints, and it's absolutely essential that you find the ones that apply to your type of device, because this will in turn impact the design, impact the features, and so on. Next, we have documentation. You need a declaration of conformity. And this is something you will find a template in Annex 5 under Part A. Keep in mind there are additional requirements that depend based on the module. You also need technical documentation and instructions for use and information. You find that under Annex 3. So this is a screenshot showing the information that you need in the Declaration of Conformity. And you can see that they also make references to the different modules. But in short, if you created a DOC under the Machinery Directive, you will be broadly familiar with this. You need to provide product information, product type, model, batch, serial number, information about your company, information about the, well, in this case, lifting machinery, a statement about responsibility, and so on. But in short, this must be issued for each individual device that you're selling. Right, so under Annex 4, you will find technical documentation. And this is essentially expanding on what was already there under the Machinery Directive. And some of these parts are actually better in the sense that the new regulation is clarifying some parts. So it's less, let's say, it's not as mysterious to figure out exactly what they mean. And that's a good trend when it comes to EU legislation, actually, that they're better clarifying what they want. But anyway, you need schematics, you need bill of materials, you need basically to put the machine on paper, and that's something you should have if you are if you're manufacturing these devices or importing them. Then some entity must have access to the bill of materials and technical documentation and so on, label files, etc. But you can find the details of what is required in the technical documentation under Annex 4. Finally, we have labeling requirements. So CE marking is mandatory for machinery and related products. Now, if your device is subject to the notified body requirement, which in turn depends on the module, then you will also need to have the identification number of the notified body. Other than the CE mark and this number, there's also traceability information you can find down here. Designation of the machinery or related to the product model, series or type, year of construction, batch and serial number so you can trace it to a specific production run, manufacturer name to ensure that your company can be identified, postal address, website, email, and other digital contact information so that you can be contacted. And you can also find additional labeling requirements under Annex 3. And this depends on the machine, can be warning statements, precaution information, and so on. Now, there are, let's say, different areas of responsibility depending on the type of company that you operate. If you are a manufacturer, then it's basically up to you to ensure that all documents are in place. You need to actively manage everything. You need to create a DOC, create a technical documentation, ensure that the product is safety tested, ensure it's correctly labeled. All of this falls on you as a manufacturer. Now, it's very important to be aware that if you have a device manufactured based on your design, or you take an existing ODM product and apply your brand name without making changes, then you are defined as the manufacturer. This is often something that comes as a surprise for importers in the EU, importing machinery from, say, China or elsewhere outside the EU, expecting to only assume importer obligations, whereas in reality, they apply their brand name, they become the manufacturer, even if they make no modifications. So this means that then it's up to you to essentially create all the compliance documentation required under the machinery regulation, book lab testing, deal with the notified body, ensure that the device is correctly labeled, and so on. Now, what about importer obligations? And the reason I bring this up is because it's been a trend, a noticeable trend in the last few years of businesses in the EU looking to buy machinery from countries outside the EU. And the way it's framed in the machinery regulation is that the importer is responsible for checking that the machine is correctly documented, that there's a DOC in place, that the technical documentation can be obtained, that there are test reports in place, that it's correctly labeled. So this can often be misunderstood as in importers not being responsible for compliance. Let me put it this way. Most machinery made outside the EU are not designed for compliance according to the machinery regulation or the machinery directive for that matter. What I'm getting to here is that it doesn't really matter if you are not responsible for creating these documents under import obligations. In practice, that's often exactly what you have to do if it turns out that they simply don't have a DOC, they don't have the technical documentation, they don't have correct labeling in place, they don't have user instructions, and so on. So whereas in theory, the importer is only there to check the documents and rely on the manufacturer, in practice, the importer is often the one that has to create these documents for the manufacturer when you're working with suppliers outside the EU. It's very important to not be confused by this and assume that you can just rely on the manufacturer when they're outside of the EU simply because you are an importer. Okay, I hope I didn't confuse you too much. If you want to learn more about compliance requirements in the EU, the US, the UK, and many other markets, go to compliancegate.com and you can access hundreds of free guides.